A woman was withdrawing money to buy ice cream for her daughter when suddenly a nearby confectionery shop exploded. No one could have imagined that the explosion would cause the underground palace of the great king to reappear, and the appearance of this ancient architecture would trigger a terrifying butterfly effect. Edward was a mathematical genius from Cambridge University. His passion for mathematics made him a monster in the eyes of others. Because of this, his advisor, Robert, was also extremely troubled. Following his wife's advice, Robert invited Edward home. He intended to advise Edward in a friendly atmosphere to discourage him from being so stubborn. Unexpectedly, during the meal, Andrea and Edward enthusiastically discussed mathematics. When the conversation became interesting, Andrea took out some photos from her bag and showed them to Edward. The photos showed ancient relics found after the Baghdad bombing. Suddenly, the photo of the base of the dome inside the palace caught Edward's attention. He discovered that it contained rules related to numbers. He picked up a pen and began to deduce on the tablecloth. In a short while, the tablecloth was covered with mathematical formulas. Before he could finish his deductions, there was no more room. Edward suggested returning to the dormitory to continue his calculations, but Robert held on to the tablecloth. Andrea said she could understand why Edward had annoyed Robert. This enthusiasm and pure heart were very much like that person's. Robert angrily took the tablecloth and went into the study, retrieved his notebook, and continued his calculations based on Edward's deductions. However, he was unaware that eyes were secretly watching him. The next day, Edward told Robert about his research project on the mysterious relationship between prime numbers and the universe. He believed that the wonders of nature were all related to prime numbers. Apples have 5 seed compartments, and most flowers have 3, 5, or 13 petals. Human chromosomes have 23 pairs. Insects need 17 seasons to transition from individual to colony. However, the entire human society is built on the basis of prime numbers because that seems easier to control. The problem now is that humans cannot control everything, so he wants to search for the rules in prime numbers. He believes the answer lies in the nature of the universe. He said this and placed the pictures Andrea had given him on the table. After a night of deliberation, he believed this was some kind of formula for the existence of prime numbers because people over 900 years ago had studied it. So he also wanted to open a path in this field. Robert, upon hearing Edward's words, immediately rejected it and bluntly advised Edward to abandon his fanciful idea. However, what happened next was even more unbelievable to Edward. All the documents he usually consulted in the library were deleted, and all the research results in the dormitory were stolen. From the dorm manager's words, Edward learned that Robert was the one who stole his documents. Edward angrily slammed the door of his office, but Robert had already left the school. He then chased after Robert to his house, determined not to give up until he achieved his goal. The door opened, and he saw Andrea. Andrea said Robert wasn't home, but he had left a message. Robert told Edward to stop there. He wanted to say goodbye to his wife, but found it difficult because he couldn't continue. He wanted her to find happiness, and it wasn't her fault. They couldn't have imagined that Robert had already passed away in his car. Before his death, he had stolen Edward's project research documents. Edward, in a state of extreme despair, accidentally discovered an envelope tucked into the rearview mirror. He opened it and found it was a letter Robert had left for him, but there were no words on the paper, only a drawing of an icosahedron. Taking advantage of the fact that no one was around at night, Edward sneaked into Robert's study. However, after searching the room for a long time, he still couldn't find his research documents. At this point, he saw the trash can nearby and sure enough found the notebook inside. The only problem was that all the valuable documents inside had been reduced to ashes. Edward angrily smashed the walls of Robert's study. The loud noise attracted the attention of the dormitory manager and security personnel. Considering Edward was the most brilliant mathematician at Cambridge University, the school board decided to give him a chance. Provided he could retract his accusations against Robert before the police intervened, Edward had to write a public apology. However, Edward didn't understand why Robert had stolen and destroyed his research documents, so he insisted on clarifying the reason. The board asked if he was willing to apologize. They received a no answer. Because of his stubbornness, Edward was forced to leave school. Having nowhere to go, he rented a small, simple apartment nearby. Adam and Taylor were peripheral agents of the U.S. Security Agency. Their job was to monitor 15 top European mathematicians. Robert was one of them. Edward's previous actions at Robert's house had caught Taylor's attention, but Taylor's focus was on monitoring Robert, so she didn't pay much attention to Edward. They wondered what Robert was doing with the tablecloth, as he seemed quite frightened. Then, when Taylor checked the surveillance video from a few days earlier, she discovered something unusual. After Robert burned the notebook in his office, he drove to the underground parking garage. After the garage door closed, white smoke billowed from inside. Taylor immediately sensed something was wrong and quickly reported it to her superior, Adam. At the same time, Edward sought out Professor Raymond, one of the most prestigious and powerful mathematics professors at Cambridge. Although Professor Raymond had retired and recently suffered from Alzheimer's, Edward still believed that only he could help him. He gave the letter to Professor Raymond and wondered why Robert had left behind the icosahedron. At that moment, Professor Raymond seemed to remember something. He then found a book that described how a student of the great mathematician Pythagoras, named Hippasus, had successfully drawn the icosahedron of a hand. The Greeks believed this was the shape of the universe and that only the gods could create it. Hippasus's actions had directly elevated him to godlike status. Pythagoras had therefore murdered him because this knowledge was taboo. While Edward was comparing the patterns, he inadvertently discovered a hidden symbol on the letter. He then went to Robert's wife, Andrea. From Andrea, he learned that Robert had become extremely stressed ever since Edward wrote the formulas on the tablecloth. The very next day, Robert burned the tablecloth, and the theft of Edward's documents occurred. Although Andrea didn't know the meaning of the letter Robert left for Edward, she wanted to know the truth behind everything. Later, Edward went to Robert's study and saw the same symbol on the money transfer slip. It was the symbol of the research institute called Capra. At this point, the picture on the wall caught his attention. Robert had told Edward that someone had previously worked on the same project as him. Andrea told Edward that the woman's name was Sophia, but she didn't want to elaborate further. After leaving Andrea's house, Edward returned to school. Edward used Professor Jameson's name to retrieve Sophia's files from the archives. The contents of Sophia's notebook were unremarkable. What surprised Edward was a drawing of an icosahedron in the corner of the notebook. That evening, someone claiming to be an employee of the Capra Research Institute approached Edward. Although Edward didn't know what the institute did, his intuition told him that his research and Robert's case were connected to this organization. Meanwhile, Taylor received news that officials had confirmed Robert's death was due to carbon monoxide poisoning. When she reviewed the previous surveillance footage, she discovered it had been maliciously edited. After analyzing the audio recording of Robert's will, she discovered that the voice wasn't his, but a synthesized voice created by artificial intelligence. After Adam confirmed the news, he immediately reported the matter to his superiors, but the final order they received was to stop the surveillance. Taylor believed things weren't that simple. The method used showed that the person who killed Robert was extremely professional. However, Adam didn't want to get into any more trouble. Wanting to keep his job, he advised Taylor not to try to investigate the truth. Before he could finish speaking, Adam was shot straight through the head. In terror, Taylor fled. Unexpectedly, the assassin arrived so quickly. The assassin fired multiple shots but still couldn't hit the target. With no escape route, Taylor finally jumped into the sea, but she couldn't have imagined that a sniper was waiting for her to surface. Looking at Sophia's notes, Edward's face showed clear disbelief. There were so many things he found hard to believe, so he decided to go and ask Professor Jameson for his opinion. Unexpectedly, as soon as he stepped out the door, staff from the Capra Institute stopped him. It seemed this institute knew all the mathematics experts at Cambridge very well. Both the recently deceased Robert and Professor Jameson, who was suffering from Angimer's disease, had an inseparable connection to this organization. Now they were targeting Edward. The Capra Institute was a private organization dedicated to nurturing talent and making the world a better place. Soon after, Edward went to Professor Jameson's house. He simply couldn't believe that a talented expert like Sophia could make such a basic mistake. All the correct answers to the calculations in her manuscript had been crossed out and replaced with incorrect numbers. It seemed intentional, and she had arranged all the incorrect results into a sequence of numbers. However, what puzzled Edward was what this sequence of numbers actually represented. Professor Jameson said he only needed to ask Sophie, but she had passed away a long time ago. Professor Jameson could only sigh in disbelief. One night, as Edward was cycling home, he suddenly noticed someone following him. He quickly turned into an alley, but unexpectedly, another person appeared behind him. Realizing something was wrong, Edward sped up, but the masked men quickly caught up. They pushed Edward to the ground, snatched his backpack, and immediately fled. Edward got up but didn't chase after them, continuing his bike ride home. However, he was unaware that a strange woman had appeared behind him at that moment. The next day, Edward went to a bar and ordered a beer. When he turned back to his seat, the woman was already seated. What puzzled Edward was that this woman not only knew his name, but also knew about the robbery the previous night. Moreover, what was stolen wasn't money or his phone, but something he was researching. He asked her who she was. She said that the people following him were also hunting her. Before she found out the truth, he was her only clue. Although Taylor didn't know what Edward was researching, she knew very well that someone was taking his research very seriously. From Edward's words, she knew that what had been stolen was Sophia's manuscript. Even though the manuscript was lost, Edward knew the contents written on it by heart. He just didn't understand why someone would be so interested in a seemingly unrelated unrelated sequence of numbers. At this moment, Taylor's words reminded him of something. They both left the bar and went to the school library. When Edward entered the sequence of numbers into the search box, the corresponding book appeared. They immediately ran upstairs, and after a while of searching, Taylor found the book. Edward flipped through it thoroughly, but he found no clues, notes, or markings. Taylor wanted to see what was going on, but Edward refused. Reluctantly, she revealed her identity as an agent of the U.S. National Security Agency. She took the book from Edward's hand, examined it carefully, and discovered several sheets of paper tucked inside the binder. Seeing the handwriting, Edward immediately recognized it as Sophia's. Just as they were about to examine the papers, the library alarms suddenly went off. With her keen senses, Taylor realized something was wrong. They went downstairs, preparing to leave. At that moment, Taylor pulled Edward back, having spotted assassins pursuing them. She dragged him back into the library. To distract the assassins, they hid behind the bookshelves. Seeing assassins appear upstairs, Edward slowly retreated. Suddenly, another assassin appeared from behind, grabbed his neck, and forcefully pinned him against a bookshelf. At that moment, Taylor arrived and subdued the assassin. Seizing the opportunity, they both ran to the emergency exit, smashed the glass door, and quickly escaped. They ran frantically to the nearby cathedral. After they sat down, Taylor told Edward about monitoring mathematicians in various countries. She wanted to know what Robert had burned before he died. She firmly believed Robert had been murdered. Her superior had also lost his life as a result. Having miraculously escaped, she sought out Edward, hoping to uncover the truth. Edward told her he was researching how to find the pattern of prime numbers. Coincidentally, what he was researching was the foundation of digital security, and if they could find the pattern of prime numbers, any digital cryptography could be cracked. Then, all government confidential bank accounts and defense systems would have nothing left to hide. However, Edward's research was only theoretical. In reality, it was impossible to achieve. At this point, they both remembered the letter Sophia had left behind. She had left a summary of her essay and asked whoever found it to reveal the truth. The letter also contained half an advertisement with the Capra Institute logo. Could her case also be connected to this mysterious institute? This was a secret organization that funded brilliant mathematicians, but getting in wasn't easy. They not only had to provide personal biometric information, but also pass rigorous professional tests. As one of Cambridge's rare geniuses, Edward had successfully gained entry to the Capra Institute. However, he wasn't there for the huge grant money, but to investigate the case of his two predecessors and search for the research documents they had left behind. A few days earlier, Taylor had advised Edward to go to the Capra Institute to search for Sophia's stolen documents. But Edward feared he would meet the same fate as Robert, being murdered. The situation was that whether Edward wanted to or not, the Capra Research Institute had already targeted him. Taylor knew Edward was afraid, but he had to go there to find the mastermind. She promised that nothing would happen to him. Driven by a desire to uncover the truth, he finally decided to enter the institute. The first thing Edward did upon arriving was to search for information, but instead of Sophia's information, he found Robert's file. Robert had been working there since 1994. Strangely, his research projects and progress were all unpublished. For 30 years, the institute had continuously provided funding to Robert. When Robert joined the institute, he and Sophia were lovers. That same year, Sophia died, and her research documents disappeared. Edward suspected that these documents might be in the institute's database, but he didn't have access to more information, so he had to find a way to get in. If this organization had been doing this for 30 years, then surely what the two people needed was inside. But how could they get in? The next day, Edward went to the research institute, and the formula on the glass wall immediately caught his attention. He instantly recognized it as research related to prime numbers. The woman standing in front of him said it was a formula she had written a few weeks earlier. Her previous research field was also prime numbers, but the institute's staff had persuaded her to abandon the research. Despite that, she was still pleased with the funding. Meanwhile, Taylor had called the head of the U.S. security agency in France. She had just reported her situation to her superior, Jane. She stated her intention to investigate the Capra Research Institute. Jane used the excuse that Taylor's current condition was unsuitable for the mission and ordered her to return to headquarters. But Taylor immediately hung up the phone. The next day, Taylor saved her phone number on Edward's phone and instructed him to contact her after arriving at the Research Institute to prepare for stealing documents from the database. At this moment, Edward suddenly had an idea. He took out the archaeological photos that Robert's wife had given him. He saw mathematical formulas left behind by ancient people in the photos. After some deduction, he realized these formulas were related to prime numbers. He believed that Robert's predicament was somehow connected to this place. Both Robert's and Sophia's research were related to the place called the Spiritual Palace. He believed that the truth about his research lay there, so he wanted to go to the site to investigate. But before going, going, they had to complete their immediate mission. Taylor said so, and then handed him a USB drive. All he needed to do was access the system and plug the USB into the computer, and she would be able to remotely decrypt the database. That evening, Edward went to the research institute and, taking advantage of the woman behind him preparing to leave, approached her and struck up a conversation. His goal was to obtain the username and password to access the document system. At that moment, the woman's identification card was lying on the table. Edward memorized the information on it with just a glance. When no one was around late at night, he called Taylor. Using the memorized username and password, he successfully accessed the Research Institute's document system. Then he plugged in the USB that Taylor had given him. With her help, he quickly found the hidden database file. Just as he was about to view the folder named Prime Numbers, an error message popped up, and the document was locked. This meant it might contain some important information. Taylor repeatedly tried to decipher it, but failed. When Edward told her the name of the operating system, she suddenly held back. This was because it was an operating system developed by a private American security company specifically for the US government. Although the system's breach rate was very low, it still couldn't escape Taylor's skills. When the folder was successfully opened, Edward also saw the list of prime number researchers. Sure enough, he found Sophia's name on the list. He clicked on the details page. The homepage showed that Sophia had signed a contract and joined the Research Institute in the same year as Robert, but the research documents showed that they had been deleted. Then Edward clicked the button next to it, and inside was a whole video of Sophia's surveillance. When he sent the screenshots to Taylor, she also realized that this was the project she was in charge of supervising top European mathematicians. She just didn't understand how the Capra Research Institute obtained this information. At the same time, Edward also found his name on the list. When he clicked on it, he discovered he was also appearing in the surveillance videos. But at that moment, the shift supervisor suddenly appeared in front of him. Although he quickly closed the web browser, the female supervisor still spotted him. Taking advantage of the moment she stepped out the door, Taylor immediately told Edward that he needed to retrieve the hard drive, and he left the Research Institute as quickly as possible. Edward pulled out the USB drive, grabbed his backpack, and quickly left the room. In the instant before the supervisor and security guards caught up, he successfully escaped the Research Institute on his bicycle. Back home, they destroyed all the hidden surveillance cameras, quickly packed their belongings, and fled the house. On the way to the airport, Taylor reported her discovery to Jane that an insider had tampered with the Syracuse project data. Her next target with Edward was the Bata Archaeological site, as it was very likely the key to the whole affair. After saying this, Taylor hung up the phone, but she had no idea that Jane was the mole. Jane told her accomplices that Taylor had investigated and knew about the mole. Edward and Taylor boarded a flight to Bata. Unexpectedly, as soon as they landed, they were being followed. Edward called Andrea, who was participating in archaeological work at an ancient site. Edward's purpose for the trip was to research the mathematical mysteries left behind by the ancients. But when they met, he didn't know how to start the conversation. Taylor was the first to break the awkward silence. She told Andrea that Robert had been murdered, but Andrea didn't believe her and asked if she had any evidence. Soon after, Edward revealed Taylor's identity and her mission to monitor leading European mathematicians. They believed that Robert's case was related to the mathematical research found in the ancient site. If they could get inside the site to investigate, they might uncover the truth and find the real killer behind everything. When Andrea learned that she and her husband had been under surveillance for years, she couldn't accept it and immediately refused Taylor's request. Their conversation ended quickly on an unpleasant note. Meanwhile, the U.S. security agency received orders from its superiors to quickly eliminate Edward. Agents in Baghdad were also awaiting Jane's final command. Jane promised she would handle the matter well. However, she didn't want Taylor to face any danger. After all, Jane had watched Taylor grow up and had trained her to become an excellent spy within the security agency. She called Taylor, advising her not to monitor Edward too closely. Jane believed Edward needed his space, but in reality, she wanted Taylor to avoid the assassination attempt. Just then, Edward suddenly appeared, causing Taylor to hang up the phone. Edward was alone at the entrance to the historical site. Andrea saw him and immediately led him to the nearby market. The two walked and chatted, unaware of the agents following them. Seeing the time was right, the agent requested permission from headquarters to carry out the assassination. After confirming Taylor was not present, Jane ordered the target eliminated. Soon, the agent drew his knife and quickly approached Edward. Coincidentally, Taylor was also strolling through the market at that moment. The knife in the man's hand quickly made her sense danger. She hurried after him, wanting to stop the assassination, but the market was too noisy, and even though she shouted Edward's name, he couldn't hear her. Just as the agent reached Edward's back, a figure suddenly leaped out from the crowd and attacked the agent. The noise on her earpiece prevented Jane from knowing what what was happening on the other side. It turned out that the person who had stopped the assassination was the guard at the historical site. He had pushed the agent into an empty warehouse and engaged in a hand-to-hand fight. Finally, the less skilled agent was strangled to death by the soldier. When Taylor ran over, she only saw the soldier's back as he fled. She approached the man and confirmed that he was dead. But Jane was unaware and continued calling out the agent's name. Hearing the commotion, Taylor immediately put on her earpiece. Unexpectedly, she heard a very familiar voice. Worried about Edward's safety, Taylor returned to the entrance of the historical site. Soon, the soldier's figure appeared in her sight. She took a picture of the soldier with her phone and sent it to the Security Bureau's facial recognition system. Through the system's matching, she quickly received a response that the soldier was a mercenary from Serbia. Although he wasn't one of their men, she was sure he wouldn't harm Edward. Thinking this, Taylor immediately left. Not long after, Jane also received news about the agent's case. Regardless of who had dealt with him, the only thing that could be confirmed was that Edward's pursuers were not just ordinary people. If they retreated now, they wouldn't gain anything. If they couldn't stop him, they had to find a way to control him. Taylor was the best tool they could use. Just as Andrea returned to the hotel, a strange man pushed her against a wall. Immediately afterward, the man pulled out a briefcase and told her it was the organization's report on the explosion at the archaeological site. The man appeared extremely panicked, shoved the report into Andrea's hand, and ran away. Before leaving, he warned her not to trust anyone at the archaeological site. Feeling something was amiss, Andrea went to Taylor. According to the report, the appearance of the ancient site this time was not a coincidence, but the result of a sophisticated explosive device. Taylor advised her to pretend it never happened and to return to the archaeological site to continue her work with Edward. After investigating, Taylor discovered that Dr. Ranier, the archaeologist in charge of the site, was also from Cambridge. She immediately felt things were getting stranger and stranger. Andrea also made a new discovery inside the site when archaeologists found a silver coin from France. It seemed someone had been studying the place thoroughly for a long time. Furthermore, traces of rubbings were found on the walls where the inscriptions had disappeared, which further confirmed her point of view. Indeed, she had found a copy of the rubbings. The original artifact was being kept in the archives of the University of Orleans in France. At the same time, Taylor approached the two women and told them about her discovery. This place was no longer safe, so she advised all three to return to Paris immediately and then find a way to get to Orleans to find the missing texts and research the tools to decipher prime numbers. From there, they could gain control and have leverage in negotiations. But Andrea insisted on staying. She even gave her translation of ancient texts to Edward and asked them to find the person who murdered Robert. Meanwhile, Jane had received surveillance video of the assassin's death and was confirming the mercenary's identity. After learning of the situation, Jane immediately called Taylor. She had already prepared plane tickets for both of them to return to France, but she couldn't have imagined that Taylor had guessed she was the mastermind behind everything. Taylor bluntly asked Jane if she had killed the man. Taylor even expressed regret that the agent had lost his life. After hanging up, Jane continued watching the video. Only when Taylor appeared in the video did she realize she could no longer hide it. Edward and Taylor returned to Paris, but their real destination was Orleans. To avoid being tracked by the security agency, Taylor bought a motorcycle at a high price from a motorcycle shop. They both rode straight to Orleans. Meanwhile, the security agency tracked Taylor's phone signal and discovered they were moving rapidly through the city. Immediately, the security agency's special forces received orders to bring them back to headquarters. According to the phone signal tracking, they had circled many streets in the city. Finally, they intercepted them in a dead-end alley. As the special forces were preparing to arrest them, they discovered that the people they were tracking weren't Taylor and Edward, but the owner of the motorcycle shop and his assistant. When the shop owner took out Taylor's phone, they realized they had been tricked. 2 hours later, Taylor and Edward appeared at the University of Orleans. They wanted to see the rubbings of archaeological artifacts from the 17th century, but these valuable collections were not on public display. Finally, Edward used his sincerity to persuade the manager, giving them the opportunity to see the collections. Edward only wanted to find the missing piece, but after examining several rubbings repeatedly, none of them matched. Just then, the library's closing announcement suddenly rang out, so they could only return the next day. When they arrived the following day, they were informed that the collection had already been loaned out. Both immediately sensed something was wrong. While still suspicious, a familiar figure appeared in their sight. Bogdan, the mercenary who had murdered the American agent in Baghdad, was here. It seemed he was the one who had borrowed the collection. Soon after, Taylor and Edward went upstairs and saw staff loading the collections into a bulletproof transport vehicle. Taylor looked up the license plate number and learned that they were transporting these items to England. The person responsible for escorting them was the mercenary Bogdan. The two of them tracked the transport vehicle until it boarded a transatlantic train from France to England. Their plan was to create chaos as the train passed through the underwater tunnel and then steal the collections from the transport vehicle. Meanwhile, Jane also received news that Bogdan would be coming to England. She suspected Taylor would be on that train, so she ordered her subordinates to immediately mobilize all their eyes and ears to monitor the train. However, just as this order was given, Edward received a call from Jane. Because Taylor didn't have her cell phone, Jane could only contact Taylor through Edward. Taylor answered the phone, but by then she had lost faith in Jane. From the tone of her voice, Taylor could sense that she was being watched. Sure enough, she saw the monitoring system on the opposite wall. After hanging up the phone, she took her laptop to the monitoring area. With the sound of typing, she hacked into the train's monitoring system and shut down all the monitors. Before the train entered the underwater tunnel, she called the mysterious number. She used coded signals to inform the caller that there was a dangerous situation on the train and requested immediate action. Immediately afterward, all the lights in the train car went out. A few seconds later, when the lights came back on, an announcement about the train accident and the arrival of rescue vehicles in 11 minutes rang out. The train staff also evacuated the passengers. Edward and Taylor hid behind the transport vehicle. Only when they saw Bogdan also following the crowd into another tunnel did they run out. Time was of the essence, so Taylor took out her device and plugged it into the door lock of the transport vehicle. At the same time, the security team was searching all the train carriages because Taylor's alarm signal indicated a bomb on board. They only had 7 minutes left. Seeing the security team getting closer, Taylor told Edward to immediately hide under the train. Suddenly, a guard saw Taylor's back and quickly approached her. However, at the last moment, Taylor heard the sound of a door lock being opened. When she turned around, the guard was standing in front of her. Taylor lied, saying she only wanted to retrieve a few things from the train, but was unexpectedly refused by the guard. As she was being forcibly led away, she removed the tools from the car's lock. Only after the security team left did Edward emerge from under the train, open the door, and climb into the transport vehicle. Seeing him inside, Taylor breathed a sigh of relief. Then, Edward rummaged through the train, looking for the missing stamp. Unexpectedly, Bogdan had seen Taylor in the tunnel. He told the driver to distract the guards while he ran back to the train car to check the transport vehicle. When he opened the rear door, Edward had already jumped down from the vehicle. The two engaged in a life-or-death chase through the tunnel. Seeing this, Taylor immediately activated a switch and controlled the computer to close the connecting compartment door. Edward slipped inside from underneath just before the door closed. Bogdan could only watch his prey escape. At the same time, Edward suspected Taylor's identity. He guessed that the person who tried to assassinate him in Baghdad was sent by the security bureau. Taylor had no choice but to tell the truth. Because of this, the two argued in the train car. Ultimately, their trust was shattered and they went their separate ways. Edward got off the train and boarded a rescue bus, but he still couldn't escape being followed. Meanwhile, Taylor boarded a large bus. As soon as she reached her seat, a man sat down next to her. Immediately afterwards, the man took out a cell phone from his chest pocket and handed it to her. On the other end was Jane. She said it seemed she had to clean up the mess for Taylor again. She wanted them to talk things through. The Cambridge genius, hunted down for his dream, ultimately fell into the hands of the U.S. security agency. This time, the person who betrayed him was his best friend. He couldn't have imagined that this person was a security agency agent. A few minutes later, Edward woke from his coma. Due to the effects of the sedative, he experienced hallucinations and saw countless sparkling particles swirling around his hands. In that moment, he seemed to see the hidden secrets of the universe. But then, the lights in the room suddenly came on. Andrew, the deputy director of the security agency, entered the room with his men. Their purpose was clear: to ask Edward to continue his research project. They gave him an essay written by Sophia. They hoped he could quickly research and find the key to deciphering any digital lock. Meanwhile, Taylor was also brought to the same building and met Jane. Jane asked Taylor if she wanted to hear her explanation. Taylor asked Jane if she would tell the truth. Finally, Jane revealed the truth. It turned out that the security agency, nominally a secret department of the U.S. government, was actually run by a private company called Ether. Because it was not bound by any regulations, this company could do many things that the government could not. The mysterious research organization Capra was funded by them. They were also the sponsors of the two deceased Cambridge mathematicians, Robert and Sophia, who were tragically murdered because they abandoned their research on prime numbers. Taylor wondered what Edward was creating the tool to decipher prime numbers for them. What did they intend to use it for? Unexpectedly, Jane said that they hadn't done anything and that possession and use were two different things. If they had this ability, they could have acted first to protect everyone. This also concerned concerned the survival of humanity. Meanwhile, Edward had begun his research project. He had covered the walls of his room with mathematical formulas that others couldn't understand. But soon after, he was stuck when faced with these formulas. At the same time, when Taylor learned that Edward was also in the building, she changed her attitude. She agreed to continue working for Jane, but on the condition that after Edward finished his research, they would release him. The next day, Edward was still staring blankly at the formulas covering the walls when suddenly the door behind him opened. A man walked in from outside, but Edward couldn't have imagined that the person standing before him was Professor Jamond. Edward couldn't accept that the security agency wouldn't leave Alzheimer's patients alone. He certainly didn't want to drag Jamond into danger because of him. He angrily wanted to erase the formulas on the wall, but Professor Jamond stopped him. Although Professor Jamond suffered from Alzheimer's with fluctuating symptoms, his passion for mathematics was absolutely no less than Edward's. When he reviewed Edward's research, he immediately wrote the formulas on the wall. Edward combined them with the drawings Robert had left behind, calculating and deducing on the wall. The two of them worked together until the final result appeared on the wall. The answer had always been there, just waiting to be discovered. This was Edward's moment of brilliance. But at that moment, Taylor suddenly appeared before them. Immediately, Taylor took Edward's notebook and began the coding process under the watchful eyes of Jane and the others. After several consecutive unsuccessful attempts, she suspected that Edward's formula was flawed. She said he might be deceiving them, but they thought she was lying. Soon after, escorted by Andrew, she went to the room and asked Edward to correct the calculation. But Edward didn't believe her. She asked him to make one last correction, and he agreed. After Taylor returned the notebook to Edward, she went to the glass window. Taylor told Jane that it was a gift for her. Then Taylor entered the code into her mobile phone. The lights in the room immediately went out, and the alarm outside sounded instantly. Taylor seized this opportunity to attack Andrew. Edward quickly erased the formulas on the wall. Immediately afterward, Taylor opened the door, and several people ran out. Andrew also stepped out of the room just before the door closed. As Edward and Professor Jamond ran out of the building, Taylor manipulated the security system to close the exit control doors. Andrew chased after them, but she found she couldn't open the door. At this point, the frail Professor Jamond was exhausted and no longer had the strength to escape. Edward told Taylor to run ahead while he and Professor Jamond watched as Andrew smashed the glass door with a fire extinguisher. Andrew drew his gun and approached them. Following the gunshot, Professor Jamond fell and died. Just then, Taylor suddenly appeared, knocking Andrew unconscious. She picked up the gun from the ground and quickly pulled the distraught Edward away, disappearing into the night. They ran at breakneck speed until Edward was completely exhausted, and where would they go next? After escaping the U.S. security agency, Taylor used Edward's research to successfully hack into the agency's system and erase all electronic records of the research. Now, a weapon capable of destroying the world exists only in this mobile phone, and who will their next target be? Meanwhile, the security bureau arrived in Capra. Jane predicted that Taylor's next target would be there, so they had to prepare in advance. At the same time, Anna received a letter from her best friend, Edward. After reading the contents, she immediately dismissed the dorm manager. Taking advantage of this opportunity, she stole Edward's dorm room key from the locker. When Edward and Taylor secretly returned to the dorm, they found Anna had prepared food for them. Taylor went into the room and thoroughly checked every corner. After confirming it was safe, she locked the gun in the drawer. Edward was still immersed in grief. If it weren't for his persistent research, his teacher would still be alive, and he wouldn't have to hide like this. Edward was disgusted with this life. He suddenly came to his senses and wanted to retaliate. Just then, Anna suddenly walked in from the door. She was the only friend Edward could trust at school. Not wanting his friend to be implicated any further, he had to tell her to stay away from him. But just as Anna turned to leave, Taylor called her back. Taylor suddenly came up with a plan to use the Academy's computers to infiltrate Capra. With the cooperation of several people, Taylor successfully infiltrated the Academy. Using a mobile phone, she easily bypassed Capra's internal system. Meanwhile, Edward, unwilling to sit idly by, burned his notebook and deliberately appeared on streets with surveillance cameras. Sure enough, intelligence officers from the security bureau spotted him in the surveillance video. When they drove to the scene, Edward quickly bypassed the surveillance and escaped. At the same time, Taylor acted. Under her control, all of Capra's internal surveillance systems were paralyzed. Jane saw that the encryption system had been unlocked and all confidential data stolen, but she had no way to counter it. Finally, Jane's subordinates tracked Taylor's location. But by the time Jane arrived at the Academy, the data transfer was complete. Her seat in front of the computer was empty, and only her own reflection appeared on the screen. At that moment, she received a message from Taylor. The photo on the phone clearly indicated she was a traitor. Taylor also sent a location. Meanwhile, Capra's employees destroyed the classified documents and were ready to flee. Using the location data, Jane spotted Taylor in a wheat field. Finally, they had to settle things. However, what she resented was that Taylor was the one who had ruined her bright future. Taylor had transmitted all the data to the U.S. security agency. What awaited Jane next was a life sentence. Edward visited Robert's house to see Andrea and recounted his experiences. More importantly, he had found the person who murdered Robert. The culprit's name was Ether. It was a private security company employing mercenaries who worked for various banks. Their interest lay in mathematical research, and the tools for solving prime number puzzles were what they feared most, as they would make their actions impossible to conceal. These were also the very things they wanted to hide. Robert had sacrificed himself protecting Edward, a fact that Edward deeply regretted. Just then, Andrea received a call from Principal James, informing her that the police were searching for Edward and had come to the school. James said he could help Edward, hoping Andrea would inform him if she knew his whereabouts. Upon learning they were together, James instructed Andrea to bring Edward to the school immediately. A few minutes later, Andrea brought Edward to the principal's office. However, James asked Andrea to leave, saying he wanted to speak to Edward privately. Seeing James's unusual behavior, Andrea was extremely confused. Meanwhile, Taylor returned to her dormitory and found her burnt notebook in the sink. She sensed something was wrong. When she noticed her locked gun was missing from her drawer, she immediately contacted Andrea. They arranged to meet at school, but as soon as Andrea hung up, she saw a familiar figure appear before her. It was Ranier, an archaeologist in charge of the Baghdad archaeological site. Seeing this, she immediately chased after him. It turned out Ranier had come to enroll his daughter. His daughter had not only received a full scholarship but was also studying in the same department as Andrea. Andrea knew that all the scholarships had already been allocated. Now, the only person who could change the decision like this was James. Later, Andrea met Taylor and learned that James was the most dangerous person, but they didn't know that James was also a mathematician. His greatest achievement was inventing public key cryptography, originally intended to protect the safety of the people, but ultimately, it became a tool for the government to cover up its crimes. Edward's research could still compensate for his mistakes, and he wanted to use it to expose the government's true face, leaving no secrets hidden. When the world descended into chaos, he would use this technology to reap the benefits. But great things always come at a price. He had previously used Andrea to discover the ancient ruins in Baghdad and sent Ranier to cause a catastrophic explosion. Edward was merely a pawn in his game. If Edward didn't want to, he would find someone else. Because Cambridge never lacked geniuses, Edward asked James if he would never give up his intentions. He received a resolute answer. Immediately afterward, Edward turned around and raised the gun in his hand. With a gunshot, James was also shot and died on the spot. At this moment, Taylor and Andrea had also arrived. Andrea gave Taylor the car keys and told her to quickly take Edward and escape. Andrea saw that the villain had breathed his last, so she picked up the gun from the ground and quickly left. Taylor drove to the suburbs. After so many things had happened, someone had to take responsibility. But weapons capable of destroying the world absolutely couldn't fall into the wrong hands. After saying this, Taylor handed her cell phone to Edward. At that moment, the sound of police sirens echoed from afar, so Edward had to quickly take the phone and leave. Taylor was arrested by the police. Not long after, the U.S. Security Services also launched an investigation into the data breach. Several high-ranking leaders were fired, and the person in charge of the investigation was the traitor Andrew. When Edward saw this news in the crowd, he silently took his cell phone out of his pocket and hesitated for a long time. That's the end of today's story. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, please give me a like and subscribe to the channel to support us. Goodbye, and see you again.